The city changes its face at midnight. For 40 years, I believed that the story of wealth was written on the 30th floor, in the quiet hum of central heating and the clean margins of corporate spreadsheets. I was wrong. The true weight of human character is tested down in the shadows, where the air smells of industrial grease and the floor is cold under thin shoes. If you have ever walked past a silent face emptying a bin or wiping a marble counter without wondering what hands did the work or what house those hands go home to, stop for 10 minutes. This is not a fable about a billionaire's curiosity. It is a clinical dissection of the distance between two actual American lives, separated not by miles, but by the devastating gap of human awareness. The industrial marble of the lobby desk at the Ashford Integrated Logistics Tower did not absorb heat. It was a cold, engineered slab of Italian Carrara, selected by an interior design firm to convey permanence, weight, and transparency to the investors who passed through the Montgomery Street entrance between the hours of 9 and 5. At 1:14 a.m., the lobby was an island of sterile, fluorescent white surrounded by the deep, wet blackness of a San Francisco November rain. Denise Carter placed the envelope on that marble surface. She did not drop it. She did not toss it. Her movements were governed by an internal discipline that treated every object in her hands as something that could break or spill if handled with haste. Her skin was dry, the tips of her fingers rough and slightly grayed from 4 consecutive hours of contact with industrial-grade trisodium phosphate and the chlorinated bleaching agents used to sanitize the executive restrooms on the upper tiers. The envelope was a standard Manila corporate stationery pack, thick enough to hold 500 individual pieces of paper, but tonight it held something denser. It contained $50,000 in uncirculated $100 bills, bound in 5 neat bank bands of purple paper. She stood over the desk for exactly 3 seconds. She used the side of her right hand, the part where the skin was thickened near the wrist, to line up the long edge of the paper with the sharp, geometric margin of the stone desk. She didn't look at the security dome hidden in the smoke-tinted glass directly above the reception station. She knew where the blind spots were. She had spent 3 years wiping the dust from the edges of those very housings with a lamb's wool duster on an 8-foot extension pole. She wasn't avoiding the camera out of guilt. She was avoiding it out of habit. In her world, looking directly into a security lens was a form of interaction. An interaction with the infrastructure of the building usually meant an incident report. Her uniform shirt, a heavy polyester blend with the words Ashford Facility Support stitched in faded blue thread over her left shoulder blade, still carried the sharp, volatile scent of pine degreaser and the dry, ancient dust that accumulated behind the intake vents of the 8th floor heating system. When she turned away from the desk, she didn't look back to see if the envelope was sliding. She walked toward the service corridor, her black rubber-soled shoes making no sound against the polished floor. These were shoes designed for traction on wet tile, heavy and wide-toed, completely devoid of style, but necessary for an 8-hour shift where a single slip could mean 3 weeks of unpaid recovery and a disputed workers' compensation claim. The service elevator was waiting. It was a utilitarian box lined with heavy quilted moving pads to prevent the stainless steel walls from being dented by the heavy plastic trash bins and industrial floor buffers. She stepped inside, pressed the button marked L, and watched the doors slide shut with a heavy, ungreased groan. To anyone watching the security feed, she was an invisible point of data moving through the lower margins of the corporate ledger. She was 32 years old, but her back had the slight, permanent curve of a woman who had spent a decade lifting objects that weighed more than 30% of her body weight. As the elevator descended toward the basement locker room, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of lined notebook paper. It wasn't the money she was thinking about. It was the bus schedule. The 38 Geary line had a gap in service between 1:22 a.m. and 2:05 a.m. If her fingers were steady enough to clear her locker and clock out by 1:17, she could hit the corner of Market and Montgomery just as the diesel engine rumbled to the curb. If she missed it, she would spend 43 minutes sitting on a metal bench with iron dividers designed to keep people from lying down, watching the rain wash the oil into the gutters while the cold aired through the thin soles of her work shoes. From the 3rd-floor glass mezzanine, the world looked like a series of clean lines. Lennox Ashford stood in the unlit corridor near the corporate compliance offices, his palms resting lightly on the cold aluminum railing. He was 58 years old, his hair a cropped, severe iron gray that matched the charcoal wool of his overcoat. He had been standing in that specific spot for 11 minutes. He had seen Denise open the waste bin in the corner of the executive lounge on 8. He had seen her hand stop when the weight of the manila envelope registered against her fingers. He had watched her count it. Through the high-definition, low-light cameras linked to the monitor in his private office, a screen he had been monitoring via his phone before walking down to the mezzanine. He had observed the precise cadence of her hands. She had counted 20 bills, then her thumbs had simply stopped moving. She didn't look around the room for a camera. She didn't slip the packet into the wide waistband of her uniform trousers. She simply closed the envelope, folded the top flap down with 3 deliberate creases, and carried it down the service stairs like it was a stack of outdated internal memos. Lennox did not go down to meet her. He did not call out as she crossed the lobby floor. He waited until the heavy glass doors of the Montgomery Street entrance clicked shut behind her before he pulled his hands from his pockets and walked toward the private elevator that led to the underground parking garage. His custom sedan was idling in the subterranean darkness, its exhaust a faint, white mist against the concrete pillars. The driver, a man named Miller who had sat behind the wheel of Lennox's cars for 9 years, didn't look back through the rearview mirror when the rear door opened. He didn't ask for a destination. He had already observed his employer's posture through the garage monitors. He knew the specific set of Lennox's jaw that meant a question would be treated as an administrative error. "Follow that woman," Lennox said, his voice flat, low, completely lacking the cadence of curiosity. "Keep 2 blocks. Do not flash the high beams." The sedan moved up the concrete ramp and broke into the wet city night. The wipers worked on an automated sensor, clearing the rain with a rhythmic, clinical sweep that sounded like a metronome in the silent cabin. Through the dark-tinted side glass, Lennox watched Denise walk. She was 200 yards ahead, her blue nylon jacket a dull speck against the wet brick walls of the financial district. She didn't walk fast. She didn't look over her shoulder. Her pace was the steady, unvarying metric of someone who knew exactly how many steps remained between her workplace and the transit stop. Lennox leaned back against the hand-stitched leather of the passenger seat. He told himself this was an exercise in risk management. A logistics company was, at its core, a network of friction points. You moved 40 tons of freight from a port in Oakland to a warehouse in Salt Lake City, and your profit margin depended entirely on the elimination of variance. If a driver falsified an inspection log, the system lost 3 hours on a highway shoulder. If a warehouse manager took 5 boxes of tablets from a broken pallet, the insurance premium adjusted by 0.5%. The entire machine was held together by the predictable self-interest of its components. But $50,000 cash was not a small variable. It was an amount that exceeded the annual gross wage of 70% of the people on his facility payroll. In his experience, honesty was either a luxury of the wealthy or a temporary performance put on by the weak when they suspected they were within the perimeter of a lens. Both versions were easy to calculate, but an unsupervised return, without a name, without a demand for a reward, done by a person whose shoes were split at the welt, was an anomaly. It didn't belong in any column of the general ledger he had spent 40 years organizing. The sedan turned left onto Battery Street, keeping its distance behind the red taillights of the municipal bus that Denise had managed to catch. Lennox watched the city change through the window. The glass towers of the banks gave way to the older, heavier stone facades of the shipping firms from the 1920s, then the street lowered into the long, gray slot of Market. The architecture was a physical representation of an income statement. The farther west you traveled from the waterfront, the thinner the stone veneer became, until the marble gave way to painted brick, and the painted brick gave way to the rusted iron fire escapes of the low-income residential hotels. The sedan stopped at the corner of Eddy and Laguna. The rain had settled into a steady, misting drizzle that clung to the windshield like grease. The streetlights here were spaced 40 yards apart instead of 20, and 3 of the lamps on the western block were dead, their copper housings corroded by decades of salt fog from the Pacific. The light that did work was a dull, high-pressure sodium yellow that made the wet pavement look like old iron. Denise stepped off the bus. She was carrying 2 bags now. Her personal canvas tote, and a plastic grocery bag containing 2 half-gallon cartons of milk and a loaf of white bread. She didn't walk toward the main entrance of her building immediately. She stopped under the working lamp post, 20 feet from the door of 741 Eddy Street. Lennox watched her through the sedan's glass. He took out his watch, a mechanical piece with an open face that allowed him to see the tiny, sapphire-capped wheels turning inside. He timed her. For 2 full minutes, she stood on the sidewalk. She set her bags down on a dry patch of concrete beneath the building's narrow concrete awning. She didn't look at her phone. She didn't open her purse. She reached up with both hands, pulled the black elastic band from her hair, and held it in her teeth while she used her fingers to comb the damp strands back from her forehead. Her face, seen through the yellow light of the sodium lamp, was gray, lines of deep, permanent fatigue etched around the margins of her mouth like valleys in limestone. Then she began the transition. She bent down, unlaced her heavy black work shoes, and pulled them off. She reached into her canvas tote and pulled out a pair of gray canvas sneakers. They were cheap, bought from a bin at a grocery store on Mission Street, but the soles were clean and dry. She wrapped her work shoes in a brown plastic bag and slid them deep into the bottom of her tote. She stood up, shook her trousers down so the cuffs hid the frayed heels of her sneakers, and took a small pack of wet wipes from her coat pocket. She wiped the gray grime of the 8th floor vent shafts from the back of her neck and behind her ears. Finally, she adjusted her face. Lennox watched her mouth move. She pulled her lips back over her teeth, relaxed them, then pulled them back again until her cheeks formed the precise shape of a woman who had spent her day in a warm, low-stress environment. She lifted her chin 3 degrees. She straightened her spine. The curve in her shoulders disappeared, replaced by an artificial posture of light, easy confidence. Lennox felt a strange, cold sensation in the pit of his stomach. He had spent 30 years watching people prepare for corporate presentations. He had sat in the anterooms of federal agencies and watched white-collar defendants practice their expressions before walking into rooms where a judge would decide if they spent 10 years in a minimum security facility in Oregon. He knew what it looked like when a human being constructed an alternate version of themselves for public consumption. But this woman wasn't walking into a courtroom. She wasn't preparing to defend an earnings report to an activist board of directors. She was standing on a cracked sidewalk in the Tenderloin at 12 minutes past midnight, creating a face for her children so they wouldn't know what the city had done to her during the previous 8 hours. She was building a defensive wall out of a smile, and she was doing it under a street lamp that hummed like a broken refrigerator next to a security door held open by a piece of wet cardboard. She picked up her bags, pushed the iron door open with her elbow, and vanished into the dark stairwell. 3 minutes later, a light came on behind a window on the 3rd floor. It wasn't the white, harsh light of an overhead halogen. It was the soft, low yellow of a 20-watt bulb under an old parchment shade. Lennox sat in the dark sedan for 20 minutes, his eyes fixed on that small square of yellow glass. The driver didn't clear the windshield. The engine stayed off. The only sound was the cool down of the car's exhaust pipe, a small, tinny pinging that sounded like a clock ticking backward in an empty room. The apartment smelled of damp plaster and the iron scent of gas from the old 4-burner stove in the corner of the kitchen. Denise didn't look at the clock when she woke. Her knees told her the time before her eyes could focus on the plastic dial above the sink. The joint in her right patella had a dull, throbbing ache that meant the temperature outside had dropped below 52 degrees and the moisture from the air shaft was condensing on the linoleum floor. It was 5:40 a.m. She stepped out of her bedroom without putting on her slippers. The floorboards in the hallway were old fir, unsealed and prone to splintering if walked on with weight, so she walked on the outer edges near the baseboards where the nails were still tight. In the kitchen, her daughter Zuri was already awake. The girl was 9 years old, but she sat at the Formica table with the stillness of an old clerk. Her 3rd-grade grammar workbook was open to page 42, her pencil held between her first 2 fingers exactly the way her teacher had shown her, her lines clean and thin. Beside the workbook was a bowl of cereal. Zuri had poured the cornflakes herself, using her left hand to steady the box so the flakes wouldn't rattle against the ceramic and wake her mother. The milk carton was sitting on the counter, 3 inches from the edge. Zuri hadn't put it back in the refrigerator because the door handle was loose and required a hard, metallic yank to clear the magnetic seal, a sound that carried through the thin lath and plaster. Walls like a gunshot. Denise walked over to the table. She didn't say good morning. She didn't ask about the homework. She reached down and touched the side of Zuri's neck with 2 fingers, checking the temperature of her skin through her flannel nightgown. Did the heat come on at 4? Denise asked, her voice dry and gravelly from the night shift. Only for 10 minutes, Zuri said without looking up from her sentence diagramming. The pipes in the bathroom made the clicking noise, then it went cold again. I used the extra blanket from the closet. Denise picked up the milk carton and slid it into the refrigerator, using her thumb to damp the sound of the latch as she clicked it shut. She turned onto the small alcove off the living room where her 5-year-old son Micah slept. He wasn't in his bed. He was sitting on the rag rug in the corner, his legs tucked under his belly, his face 3 inches from a large sheet of gray butcher paper he had found behind the kitchen bin. He was drawing. He had been using a single blue crayon. The paper wrapper had been peeled off down to the wax stub to draw a series of concentric circles that covered the lower right quadrant of the page. He didn't look up when his mother's shadow fell across his shoulder. He didn't make a sound. "Micah," Denise said softly. "Look at me, baby." The boy's shoulders tightened. He kept his eyes on the blue wax, his hand moving in a small, tight radius. Asterisk circle. 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 Asterisk. The wax was layered so thick it had begun to shine under the morning light coming through the air shaft window. "He's been doing that since 5, Zuri said from the table. He wanted the yellow one, but it broke yesterday when he tried to draw the big circle on the wall behind the couch. I told him he couldn't have another one until Friday." Denise knelt down on the rug. Her knees made a sharp, cracking sound that made Micah pause for a fraction of a second. His hand hovered an inch above the paper, his fingers twitching slightly. "Micah," she repeated, her voice dropping into a low, melodic register she used only within the walls of the apartment. "Say blue. Look at the paper, baby. Blue." The boy's lips came together. They were dry, slightly chapped at the corners. His jaw shifted to the left, then his teeth came together with a soft click. He let out a long, shuddering breath through his nose, but no sound came from his vocal cords. He reached out with his left hand, picked up a tiny fragment of yellow crayon from the floor, and pressed it into the center of the blue circles. He pointed at it. His finger stayed there, pressing down until the nail turned white under the pressure. "He wants the moon book," Zuri said. "But we had to return it to the Larkin Street branch on Tuesday because the renewal was up. I told him we could get it back on Sunday after your shift change." Denise looked at her son's finger pressed against the wax. She felt the heavy, physical presence of the wait list inside her chest, a sensation she had carried for 11 months like an unexploded shell. In San Francisco County, an initial speech-language evaluation through the regional center was free under California's early intervention services, but the treatment plan was subject to a staffing matrix that was perpetually under-resourced. When she had called the caseworker in October, a woman whose voice sounded like she was reading from an old insurance policy had told her that Micah was number 42 on the active list for his zip code. "If you have private coverage," the caseworker had said over the crackle of a cheap headset, "the wait is usually less than 3 weeks. Most providers in the financial district have slots if you can bring him in during the morning hours." Private coverage through the custodial union contract at Ashford Logistics was a nominal benefit. It paid 80% of standard medical costs after a $1,200 deductible, but the mental health and developmental therapy section contained a hidden clause. Covered services are limited to 12 diagnostic visits per calendar year, subject to prior authorization by the third-party administrator. A 12-visit limit meant 3 weeks of actual therapy for a child with a severe speech delay. After that, the rate adjusted to $220 per hour, cash up front, payable at the reception desk before the child was allowed into the small room with the plastic toys and the mirror glass. Denise stood up. She walked back to the kitchen, opened the cabinet above the sink, and took down a small glass jar containing $42 in single bills and crumpled fives, the remaining cash from her 2-week envelope after the landlord's money order had been purchased. She looked at the bills. They didn't change color. They didn't grow. They just sat there, thin and green and insufficient for any problem that couldn't be solved with a loaf of bread or a package of generic diapers. On Monday afternoon, Lennox Ashford's desk was empty except for a single sheet of cream-colored paper. The paper had no letterhead, no corporate emblem, and no signature at the bottom. It had been delivered by a courier from an investigative agency on Sutter Street that specialized in asset verification and background checks for executive hires. Lennox read the lines through his reading glasses, his left hand holding a gold pen that remained motionless over the blotter. Subject: Carter, Denise Lorraine. D.O.B. August 14, 1993. Place of birth: San Francisco, California. Current address: 741 Eddy Street, Apartment 3C, Section 8 Unit. Employment: Ashford Facility Services, Custodial Level 2. Hire date: April 11, 2023. Wage rate: $17.85 per hour. Average hours per week: 35. Night shift. Dependents: 1. Carter, Zuri, 9 years. Enrolled: John Sweat Elementary. 2. Carter, Micah, 5 years. No enrollment record. Developmental delay status. Financial status: no real property. No vehicle registration on file. Transit user. 1 active checking account, Wells Fargo. Average balance 90 days, $44.12. Credit score: 512. Collection records for medical debt: SF General Hospital 2021. Additional notes: subject's transit card shows regular activity on Saturday mornings consistent with travel to Solano State Prison, Correctional Facility. Subject has an active account with the inmate commissary system under name: Carter, Terrell, brother. Inmate #T88421. Regular monthly disbursement of $40 observed since 2024. Lennox turned the page over. The reverse side was blank. He looked at the white space for several seconds. Then he reached for his phone and pressed the speed dial button for the Vice President of Human Resources. Marcus, Lennox said when the line clicked. I'm looking at the facility support contract for the Montgomery building. Who manages the Employee Assistance Fund for the night shift? There was a brief pause on the line, the sound of paper shifting over a desk 3 floors below. That fund is managed by a third-party trustee, Mr. Ashford. It's part of the collective bargaining agreement. It's designed for acute emergencies: fires, evictions, funeral costs. Why do you ask? How many applications did we have from the custodial team last year? 2, Marcus said. Both were denied because the applicants couldn't produce 3 consecutive utility shutoff notices to prove imminent hardship. The criteria are quite strict to prevent abuse by the hourly staff. Who drafted those criteria? The legal team did, back in 2021, during the restructuring. We wanted to ensure the fund didn't become a secondary compensation stream. It's standard practice across the logistics sector. Lennox hung up without saying goodbye. He took off his glasses and dropped them onto the blotter. He looked at the background report again. His eyes stopped on the line. Regular monthly disbursement of $40 observed since 2024, $40 a month. To a man sitting in an 8x10 cell in the Central Valley, $40 was 60 packages of instant ramen or 8 books of first-class stamps. It was the price of survival in a market where a single bar of soap cost 3 times its retail value on the outside. To Denise Carter, $40 was the price of 3 lunches a week that she didn't eat. It was a mathematical choice made on a kitchen table under an air shaft window. The stomach of her brother versus the lining of her own stomach. He thought about his own son, Kendrick. Kendrick was 28. His office was on the 24th floor, its windows facing east toward the Berkeley Hills. His salary was $140,000 a year, with a bonus structure linked to the regional volume metrics. Last month, Kendrick had submitted an expense report for a 3-day client dinner at a sushi restaurant on San Bruno Avenue. The total had been $4,212, including a $1,200 bottle of sake that had been opened but not finished because the client had left early to catch a flight to Seattle. Lennox had signed the expense voucher without looking at the itemized lines. To the corporate system, $4,000 was a minor transaction cost, a rounding error in the marketing budget. It didn't require an explanation. It didn't prompt an audit. It was an accepted friction point in the mechanism of wealth generation. He reached down, picked up the cream-colored sheet of paper, and slid it into his pocket. He didn't want it sitting in his office files where an administrative assistant might scan it into the compliance database. He didn't want it to become part of the system. He wanted it to stay small, specific, and unquantified. The house on Newcomb Avenue had been 32 feet wide and 60 feet deep. built from redwood timbers that had been cut in the North Bay before the Second World War. It sat on the edge of Bayview Hunters Point, 3 blocks from the old naval shipyard where the iron hulls of the Pacific Fleet had been scraped down and painted with lead-based red oxide during the long years of the Cold War. Denise's father, Reginald Carter, had owned that house. He had paid for it across 24 years of work as a licensed commercial plumber, his knees permanently calloused from hours spent kneeling in the wet gravel beneath the foundations of the homes in Pacific Heights and the marina. He was a small man with shoulders that stayed round even when he was sitting in his Sunday suit at the African Methodist Episcopal Church on 3rd Street. He had one rule for his children, and he repeated it until the words had become part of the structure of their minds, like the studs behind the drywall. He didn't say it with anger. He said it with the dull, unvarying weight of an inspector checking a water pipe for a leak. "If it isn't yours," he would say, sitting at the kitchen table while his wife Clarice wiped the grease from his forehead with a damp cloth, "it isn't yours. Don't care if the man who lost it has 10 more like it in his garage. Don't care if you haven't seen a piece of meat in your soup for 3 days. You touch what isn't yours, and you give away your right to look the world in the eye. And once that's gone, you don't buy it back. Not for $1 million. Denise had been 8 years old when she found a $20 bill on the floor of the Safeway store on 3rd Street. It was wedged between the cereal aisle and the frozen fish section, folded into a tight, greasy square that smelled of old mints. Her heart had made a sharp, clean leap into her throat. $20 in 2001 was 5 books of drawings or a pair of red canvas shoes that didn't have someone else's name written on the inside collar in permanent marker. She had held it out to her father, her fingers shaking with the excitement of an accidental fortune. Reginald hadn't taken the bill. He had looked at her hand. Then he had looked down at her face, his eyes heavy under his gray eyebrows. He didn't say a word. He walked her by the elbow to the customer service desk at the front of the store, where a girl with a blue smock was smoking a cigarette next to the lottery machine. "My daughter found this by the peas," Reginald said to the girl. "Someone's going to come back for it. Put it in the drawer." The girl had looked at the bill. Then he had looked at Reginald with a tiny, cynical twist of her lip. "Sure, mister," she said, dropping the 20 into an empty cigar box under the counter. "I'll make sure the president gets it." Denise had cried on the walk back to Newcomb Avenue, her small feet dragging against the concrete of the sidewalk. "She's just going to keep it," she had sobbed. She didn't care about the person who lost it. Reginald stopped walking. He knelt down on the pavement, his knees making that same dry, clicking sound that Denise's knees would make 25 years later in the Tenderloin. He took her hands in his fingers thick and yellowed from pipe dope and iron grease. "Doesn't matter what her hands do," he said, his voice dropping into her ears like a heavy stone into a, "Well, her hands are her business. Your hands are mine. Your hands gave it back. You remember how that feels in your fingers, Denise. That's the only thing that belongs to you when you walk out of this world." Reginald died when Denise was 19. A stroke took him on a Tuesday afternoon while he was clearing a sewer lateral beneath a Victorian home in Daly City. He was 61 years old. He died with his boots on, his head resting against the main clean-out valve, his wrench still locked onto the iron nut. The math of the family changed within 72 hours of his death. Denise was in her 2nd semester at the City College of San Francisco, studying accounting because she liked the way the numbers on a balance sheet always settled into a zero-sum equilibrium at the end of a column. She dropped out on Friday. There was no insurance policy. There was no pension from the plumbing firm. There was only the house on Newcomb Avenue and her mother's kidney disease, which had reached the stage where 3 visits a week to the dialysis center on Geary Boulevard were necessary to keep her blood from turning to vinegar. Denise took a job cleaning rooms at a motel near the airport for $9 an hour. She learned how to strip a bed in 40 seconds. She learned how to remove the scent of cheap tobacco from synthetic drapes using a chemical spray that made her skin peel around the cuticles. Her brother Terrell was 14 then. He stayed in the house alone while Denise was at the motel and their mother was in the clinic, his eyes fixed on the empty street where the older boys from the housing blocks were driving cars that didn't have rusted fenders. He was 21 when the police found 3 ounces of methamphetamine and a loaded 9mm pistol under the floorboards of his bedroom. The judge gave him 8 years because he had a prior possession charge from high school, and because the public defender had 42 other files on his desk that morning and couldn't remember Terrell's middle name during the 5-minute bail hearing. Denise paid the legal fees out of the remaining equity in the Newcomb Avenue house. When the house was sold to a developer from San Jose who flipped it into a 3-unit condominium for tech workers, she took her mother's old ceramic lamp, 3 boxes of clothes, and moved into a studio apartment behind the freeway ramp on Potrero Hill. Her mother died 2 months later, her heart simply giving out during a 4-hour blood filtration cycle while the television above her bed was playing a game show with the sound turned down. Lennox Ashford knocked on the door of apartment 3C at exactly 9:15 a.m. on Saturday. He didn't have his driver with him. He had parked his sedan 3 blocks away on Golden Gate Avenue, next to an abandoned church whose steps were covered in sleeping bags. He had walked the 3 blocks through the rain, his wool coat absorbing the damp fog until it felt heavy against his shoulders. The door opened after 20 seconds. Denise didn't take the chain off. She looked at him through the 6-inch gap, her hair wrapped in an old green cotton scarf, a plastic bottle of Clorox spray in her right hand. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice completely flat. "The office is on Montgomery. If there's an error on my timesheet, the supervisor handles that on Monday morning." "There's no error on your timesheet, Ms. Carter," Lennox said. He held his hands outside his pockets so she could see they were empty. "I'm here about the envelope you left on the marble desk on Thursday night." Denise's face didn't move. She shifted her weight to her left hip, her sneakers squeaking slightly against the linoleum inside. "I left a note with it. It said where I found it. I don't have anything else to say about it." "The envelope had $50,000 in it," Lennox said. "I know," she said. "I counted it. Why did you leave it?" Denise looked at him for 5 seconds through the wood gap. Her eyes were an old brown, completely lacking the light of deference that Lennox was used to seeing in the faces of his employees. "Because it wasn't mine. I think I wrote that on the paper too." Lennox didn't move. He kept his voice low, matching her cadence. "The envelope didn't belong to the company, Ms. Carter. It belonged to my son. He left it in the executive lounge after a private meeting on Wednesday. He didn't even notice it was gone until we ran the discretionary fund audit yesterday afternoon." Denise looked down at his shoes, then back at his chin. "Then you should give it back to him. He's the one who lost it." She began to close the door. Lennox put his palm flat against the wood, not hard enough to force it, but with enough weight to stop the latch from clicking into the frame. "I'm offering you a position in the logistics management office at the Port of Oakland," he said quickly, before the wood could meet the jam. "Operations coordinator. The starting rate is $32 an hour. It's an exempt administrative post. It includes full family coverage through our premium plan, the one with 0 deductible for pediatric speech therapy." The door stopped moving. Through the gap, Lennox could see Zuri standing in the small hallway behind her mother, her arms wrapped around a large green dictionary she had checked out from the library. "I don't have a degree, Mr. Ashford," Denise said, her hand tightening on the Clorox bottle. "I have a high school diploma from a school that was torn down 10 years ago. I don't know how to run your logistics software." "The company has an educational development fund," Lennox said. "It's been in the budget since 2022. It pays for a 6-month certificate course at the City College of San Francisco. We've funded 12 slots a year for the past 4 years. Do you know how many people from your division applied for it last year?" "Nobody," Denise said. "Because the handbook is kept in the supervisor's locked cabinet in the basement, and you have to ask for the key in writing 3 days in advance." Lennox felt a small, sharp throb behind his eyes, the feeling he got when a supplier delivered a shipment of freight with a broken manifest. "The program is there, Ms. Carter. It's written into the corporate tax schedule. If you take the post, the slot is yours. You'll work 20 hours a week in the office and spend 20 hours a week in the classroom. Your full salary will be paid across the entire 6 months." Denise didn't unlatch the chain. She looked past his shoulder at the dirty brick wall of the hallway. "I have to think about it," she said. "The slot opens on Monday morning at 8, Lennox said. "The office is at Pier 40. If you aren't there, I'll assume you've decided the night shift suits you better." "I'll let you know when I know," she said, and closed the door. This time, the latch clicked into the iron plate with a sound that was final. The receipt from the Safeway on Webster Street was 3 inches wide and 7 inches long, printed on thin thermal paper that had turned purple near the bottom where it had touched a drop of condensation from the milk carton. Denise sat at the kitchen table on Saturday night, the pencil stub held between her thumb and index finger, her lines drawn with a ruler she had borrowed from Zuri's school kit. The numbers were small, but they were absolute. Gross income, current $17.85 x 35 hours equals $624.75 per WK. Taxes and union dues, estimated 22% minus $137.44. Net take-home, $487.31 per WK, $1,949.24 per MO. Fixed expenses, rent, Section 8 share $412, PG&E, gas/electric $114, Muni Transit Pass, adult $81, Terrell's Commissary, $40, food and laundry, $650, Micah's crayon/paper supply, $25. Total fixed, $1,322. Remaining margin, $627.24 per MO, $156.81 per WK. She looked at the proposed numbers for the new position. $32 an hour meant $1,280 a week before taxes. It meant a net take-home of nearly $3,600 a month, more than double her current income. It was an amount of money that could buy a new pair of winter boots for Zuri without requiring her to skip her own lunch for 3 weeks. It could buy a 5-pound chicken for Sunday dinner every single week. But the shift was from 8 to 5. She looked at the corner of the paper where she had calculated the transit times. The bus from Eddy Street to Pier 40 required 2 transfers, the 38 Geary to Market, then the T3rd streetcar down to the waterfront. In the morning, with the commuter traffic from the East Bay filling the intersections, the trip would take 50 minutes. In the evening, it would take an hour and 10. If she left the office at 5 p.m., she wouldn't reach the corner of Eddy and Laguna until 6:15 p.m. Zuri's school finished at 3 p.m. The after-school program at the community center had a sliding scale fee that adjusted to $90 a month, but the waiting list for 3rd graders was 74 names long. If Zuri walked home alone at 3, she would spend 3 hours sitting on the steps of 741 Eddy Street, her dictionary in her lap, watching the drug transactions happen at the corner of the block while the rain came down on her head. Micah's Daycare, a subsidized program run by a church on McAllister Street, closed its doors at exactly 4:30 p.m. The late fee policy was printed on pink cardstock and taped to the check-in desk. $1 per minute for every minute after 4:30 p.m. After 3 late arrivals in a single semester, the child's slot will be permanently revoked. If Denise took the day job, she would be late every single day. She would owe $45 an evening in late fees, $225 a week, $900 a month. The entire increase in her salary would be absorbed by the penalty system of the city's childcare infrastructure. The corporate ledger would show she was earning more, but her checking account would settle back into that same $42 average balance by the end of the month. She dropped the pencil. She pressed her palms against her eyes until she saw blue circles, the same circles Micah had been drawing all morning on the butcher paper. Hope was an expensive item in her neighborhood. It was something you reached for when your defense system was weak, and every time you reached, the world found a new way to show you the fine print on the contract. She had spent 15 years eliminating risk from her life by keeping her expectations down to the level of the asphalt. She didn't look at the store windows on Union Street. She didn't open the travel brochures they left in the recycling bins on the 9th floor. She lived in the small, safe gray space between her mop bucket and her linoleum floor. "Mom," Zuri said from the doorway of the bedroom. She had a small piece of notebook paper in her hand, torn from her grammar workbook. "Go to sleep, Zuri," Denise said without taking her hands from her face. "It's past 10. The girl walked into the kitchen, her bare feet making no sound against the wood. She laid the paper down on top of the Safeway receipt, right over the column of figures Denise had been drawing. The note was written in pencil, the letters rounded and heavy. "I can watch Micah. I already do when you are sleeping in the afternoon. He likes it when I read the dictionary to him. I can make the cornflakes." Denise looked at the note. She didn't pick it up. She looked at Zuri's face. The girl's skin was smooth, but her eyes had that same flat, watchful stillness that Denise had seen in her own mirror when she was 12 years old. It was the face of a child who had realized that her mother was the only thing standing between her and the concrete, and who had decided to become a pillar before her time. "You're 9 years old, Zuri," Denise said, her voice dropping until it was barely a whisper against the hum of the refrigerator. "You aren't a mother." "I know," Zuri said, her chin lifting those 3 degrees, the exact angle Denise had practiced under the sodium lamp the night before. "But I can do it for 6 months. Until the certificate is done." I checked the dictionary. Logistics means keeping things from hitting each other while they are moving. "We can do that." On Sunday at 2 p.m., the door to apartment 3C rattled under a heavy, slow series of knocks that sounded like they were being delivered by a heavy iron tool. Denise opened the door. Loretta Mae Simmons was standing in the hall, wearing a faded blue chenille bathrobe over her cotton nightgown and a pair of white orthotic sandals with Velcro straps. She was holding a large white ceramic casserole dish with an old linen tea towel tied around the handles to keep the heat in. "Move out of the way, Denise," Loretta said, using her shoulder to clear the frame as she stepped into the kitchen. "My ankles are swelling today, and I don't feel like standing in that drafty hallway while you decide if you're too proud to talk to me." She set the dish down on the Formica table, right next to Denise's ledger sheet. The towel came off, revealing a heavy mass of baked macaroni and cheese, the top crust burnt to a deep, dark brown around the edges where the grease had bubbled up. "I made too much," Loretta said, sinking into the chair Zuri had occupied that morning. "The nephew from Oakland called and said he wasn't coming over because the traffic on the bridge was backed up from an accident. I ain't going to eat this by myself. It'll just sit in my icebox until it turns gray." Denise stood by the sink, her arms crossed over her chest. "Loretta, you've made too much food every Sunday for 3 years. Your nephew hasn't been over here since the new year." "He's a trifling boy," Loretta said, waving her hand with a sharp, dismissive snap of her wrist. "Just like his father. Don't change the subject. I heard you through the wall last night. You were doing that loud arithmetic until 2 in the morning. The pipes in my bathroom carry the sound of that pencil scratching right into my earhole." Denise didn't answer. She looked at the macaroni crust. It smelled of real cheddar and butter, the kind of food that costs $6 a pound at the grocery store on Market. "The white man with the nice coat was back here yesterday morning," Loretta said, her eyes fixing on Denise's face like 2 dark, heavy rivets. "The gossip down at the laundry room says he's the one who owns the big building down on Montgomery. Is that true?" "Yes," Denise said. "What's he want with you?" "He offered me an office job. At the port. Day shift. And you told him no because you're stubborn as a government mule," Loretta said, her voice rising into a sharp, clear register that sounded like a postal clerk rejecting a package with insufficient postage. "I told him no because the hours don't work for the kids," Denise said, her voice tightening. "I can't be back here at 3 to catch Zuri off the bus. I can't hit the daycare before the late fees turn my check into water. You know how the system works here, Loretta. You can't just change your hours without someone paying for it." Loretta stood up. She walked over to Denise, her short, wide body moving with a heavy, deliberate rocking motion that had been built by 30 years of carrying a 30-pound leather mail pouch through the hills of the Richmond district. She stopped 6 inches from Denise's nose, her breath smelling faintly of peppermint and chicory coffee. "You listen to me, Denise Lorraine," Loretta said, her finger coming up until it was 2 inches from Denise's chin. "I've lived in this building since 1994. I've seen 12 different girls move into that unit with babies, and I've seen 10 of them walk out with their clothes in a garbage bag because they couldn't make the math work. You're the only one who scrubs the hallway outside your own door. You're the only one who doesn't let her children run wild on the fire escape at midnight." She paused, her breathing heavy and shallow through her nose. "You bring those babies to my door at 7 o'clock on Monday morning," she continued, her voice dropping into a low, gravelly command that brooked no argument from a general ledger or a supervisor. "I'll see that girl onto her bus. I'll be sitting on that green crate by the front door when she gets back at 3. And Mike is going to sit in my front room and watch the television while I make him eat his peas. Do you hear me?" Denise looked down at the old woman's sandals. The white leather was cracked around the toes, the Velcro straps gray with old lint. "Loretta, I can't pay you what a daycare costs. I won't have the money until the 1st of the month." "Did I ask for your money?" Loretta snapped, her hand coming down onto the Formica table with a loud smack that made the pencil stub roll into the sink. I get my pension check from the federal government every third Wednesday like clockwork. I don't need your $16 an hour. I need you to walk out of this building and show those people on Montgomery Street that a girl from Bayview can run their computers just as good as some boy from Stanford. She turned around, took her tea towel from the counter, and walked toward the door. She stopped with her hand on the brass knob, her back still round under the blue chenille. The macaroni needs 20 minutes in the oven if you want the cheese to run, she said without looking back. And make sure that boy washes his hands before he touches my table. I don't want no blue crayon marks on my lace tablecloth. She stepped into the hall, and the door swung shut. Denise stood in the center of her kitchen for a long time. The room was silent except for the low, rhythmic thrum of Micah's crayon against the butcher paper in the alcove. She walked over to the sink, picked up the pencil stub, and walked back to the table. She didn't draw a new line. She reached down, picked up the note Zuri had written, and folded it twice until it was the exact size of the small plastic card slot in her wallet. She slid it in behind her mother's old $20 bill, the one that had remained crisp and unspent for 6 years because nothing in her life had ever been worth the price of its absence. The office at Pier 40 did not look like the corporate tower on Montgomery Street. It was a 2-story structure built from corrugated steel panels that had been painted in industrial seafoam green, a color that had faded under 30 years of salt mist and the heavy, sulfurous exhaust from the container vessels that berthed 50 yards away at the crane line. Denise sat at her desk on the second floor, her eyes fixed on a dual-monitor terminal that displayed a real-time matrix of the regional shipping lanes. The screen was a chaotic grid of red, green, and amber blocks, each representing a 40-foot container moving across the Pacific corridor via rail, ship, or long-haul tractor. It was 7:45 a.m. on her third Monday. She had been in the office for 45 minutes. Her supervisor, a man named Henderson who had spent 22 years with Ashford Logistics, and whose left arm was missing below the elbow from a coupling accident in the rail yard, walked past her station with a cardboard tray containing 2 paper cups of black coffee. The manifest for the Ashford Mariner is running 60 units short on the Oakland discharge, Henderson said, dropping one of the cups onto her blotter without pausing his stride. The rail yard at Richmond says they don't have the chassis line to pull them off before the midnight shift change. Fix it. Denise didn't look up from her keyboard. Her fingers moved across the numeric pad with the same rapid, unthinking cadence she had used when she was counting the bills in the executive lounge. The Richmond yard has 16 terminal tractors sitting in the maintenance bay because the contractor didn't clear the emission certificates on Thursday morning. I checked the compliance log at 7. The certificates were signed off at 4 yesterday afternoon. Call the gate manager. Tell him the tractors are legal. He has the drivers on the extra board. Henderson stopped walking. He turned his head, his single hand resting on the back of her chair. He looked at her screen. Then he looked at her face, his eyes small and gray under his grease-stained cap. "How long you been looking at that log, Carter?" he asked. "Since 7:10, she said, her index finger hitting the enter key with a sharp, clean click. The gate manager doesn't update his system until 8:30 because he likes to finish his eggs before he runs the reports. If you call him now, you can get the line moving before the union break." Henderson let out a short, dry sound through his nose that was his version of a laugh. "You're a weird girl, Denise. The boys from the business school usually spend their first month asking me where the water cooler is and how to log into the corporate portal. The boys from the business school have people waiting to buy them lunch, Mr. Henderson," she said, her eyes shifting to the next column of the manifest. "I don't. I have an hour and 10-minute bus ride at 5 o'clock. She didn't tell him that she had spent 3 hours every night for the past 2 weeks reading the logistics management manuals she had checked out from the main library on Larkin Street. She didn't tell him that she had spent her lunch hours sitting on a plastic bench by the container crane, watching the ground crews hook the twist locks onto the container corners until she could calculate the cycle time of a crane arm down to the 5-second mark without looking at the digital timer on the control shack. She didn't need his praise. She needed his logbook. She had discovered within her first 48 hours that the entire management system of the port was built on top of a massive layer of unrecorded habits. The analysts on Montgomery Street write reports based on the assumption that every truck moved at 55 miles an hour and every crane operated at 98% efficiency. They didn't know that the gate at Pier 40 had a broken weight sensor that required every third driver to back out and re-enter the lane, a process that cost 4 minutes per truck and accumulated into a 45-minute block of dead time by 3 in the afternoon. Denise knew it because she had seen the trucks sitting from her window. She had watched the drivers step out of their cabs to smoke cigarettes while their engines idled, their exhaust a dark cloud against the water. She had counted the cigarettes. She had done the math on her legal pad during the 15-minute morning break while the other clerks were talking about the football game. The office of Dr. Yvonne Hadley sat on the second floor of a medical building on Sutter Street, 3 blocks from the upscale stores of Union Square. The waiting room had no plastic chairs. It had a large wool rug from Turkey and a small water fountain that made a low, bubbling sound like a brook in the woods. It was Tuesday afternoon at 3:15 p.m. Denise sat in the observation booth behind the one-way glass, her coat in her lap, her eyes fixed on Micah. The boy was sitting on a small wooden stool across a low table from Dr. Hadley. Dr. Hadley was 54, wearing a gray tweed jacket with elbow patches and a pair of silver-rimmed spectacles that hung from a black silk cord around her neck. She had a box of small wooden blocks in front of her, some red, some blue, some painted with the shapes of animals. "Micah," Dr. Hadley said, her voice carrying through the small intercom speaker above Denise's head with a clear, resonant clarity. "Look at the red bird. Put the bird on top of the blue house." Micah didn't touch the blocks. He reached out with his left hand, picked up a blue square, and turned it over 3 times, his thumb checking the texture of the painted wood. His lips were pressed together into a tight, thin seam. "Micah," Dr. Hadley repeated, her voice unhurried, perfectly patient. She didn't move her hand. She didn't repeat the command. She waited. 10 seconds passed. The silence in the observation booth was heavy, the only sound the click of Denise's watch gears. Micah's jaw shifted. He let out a small, sharp breath through his nose. He looked at Dr. Hadley's mouth, not at her eyes, but at the line where her lips met. His own lips parted, his tongue coming forward until it touched his upper teeth. "B bird," he said. The word was small, dry, the R sound completely missing, but it was a word. It wasn't a click, it wasn't a breath. It was a noun. Denise didn't move. She didn't lean forward against the glass. She took her right hand, placed it over her mouth, and pressed her fingers into her cheeks until the skin turned white under the pressure. Her breath came in a long, shaky shudder that she caught in her throat before it could turn into a sound. Behind the glass, Dr. Hadley didn't clap. She didn't give him a piece of candy. She reached into her box, pulled out the red bird, and placed it flat in the palm of Micah's hand. "The bird is red, Micah," she said softly. "Thank you for telling me." After the 45-minute session was over, Dr. Hadley stepped into the observation booth, her spectacles hanging flat against her jacket. She had a thick manila file folder under her arm, Micah's chart, which had grown by 12 pages since her first intake appointment in March. "He's responding to the rhythmic prompting, Ms. Carter," Dr. Hadley said, sitting in the chair next to Denise. "The speech delay isn't structural. It's an expressive processing block. His mind is moving faster than his motor cortex can coordinate the muscles of his tongue." She paused, looking down at her folder. "I looked over the charts you brought from your home exercises," Dr. Hadley continued, turning her head to look at Denise. "The flashcards with the crayon drawings? The ones you taped to your refrigerator?" "Yes," Denise said, her hand still resting on her purse strap. "We did them every night before my shift. 5 words a week." Dr. Hadley let out a soft, warm sigh. "You've been doing the foundational work of an early intervention specialist with a library card and a roll of masking tape, Denise." His phonemic awareness was already established when he walked into my office. He just needed the clinical space to feel that the silence wasn't a punishment. Denise looked through the glass at Micah, who was sitting on the rug, using 3 of the red blocks to form a small, neat line next to his sneaker. "The system put him on a list, Dr. Hadley. If I hadn't done the work, he'd still be sitting on that rug drawing circles until he was 7 years old." "I know," Dr. Hadley said. "The system is a machine that doesn't have an eye for the details. But you do. What you did in that kitchen was more important than anything I'm going to do in this office over the next 6 months. You kept the path open. On a Thursday afternoon in April, the rain had stopped, replaced by a cold, gray wind that blew the salt spray off the bay and hattered the corrugated panels of the Pier 40 office. Denise was working her way through the quarterly inventory reconciliation report for the third-party carriers, a 300-page spreadsheet that listed every container that had passed through the Ashford gate since the new year. At 4:12 p.m., her finger stopped on row 14,412. Container ID, ANL 8842, B, Carrier, Pacific Horizon Transit. Gate entry, February 11th, 2026, 14:22 p.m. Discharge gate, February 11th, 2026, 15:02 p.m. Chassis ID, CH 9912, Driver, Unassigned, Contract Rotation. Tear weight, 8,400 pounds. Registered discharge weight, 42,100 pounds. Bill of lading status, closed. Container reconciliation, matched. She looked at the weight column. She opened her secondary screen and pulled up the gate sensor log for February 11th. She traced the time stamp, 14:22 p.m. The gate sensor log showed the actual scale weight of container ANL, 8842, B when it crossed the threshold, 42,100 pounds, but the warehouse receiving log for the South Hub, the facility located 11 minutes away from the highway ramp, showed the internal manifest weight when the container was unsealed at 16:40 p.m., 38,400 pounds, a discrepancy of 3,700 pounds. She checked the commodity code. It was Category 42, high-density lithium-ion battery packs for commercial energy storage systems, shipped from a manufacturer in Nagoya, Japan. Each individual battery pack weighed exactly 42 pounds and was packed 80 to a pallet, wrapped in heavy black polyethylene film. 3,700 pounds was exactly 88 packs. It was an entire pallet, plus 8 loose units. She looked at the reconciliation report again. The system had marked the row with a green check mark, asterisk matched, asterisk why? Because the compliance software was programmed to compare the gate discharge weight with the bill of lading, not with the warehouse receiving log. As long as the paperwork from the ship matched the paperwork from the gate, the computer assumed the cargo was intact. The warehouse log was treated as an internal operating sheet, scanned into a separate server that wasn't linked to the audit loop. Denise sat back in her chair. Her fingers were cold. She knew what this meant. It wasn't an administrative error. It wasn't a broken scale. A broken scale would have shown a variance across every container that crossed the gate on February 11th. But rows 14,410 and 14,414 were clean. Their gate weights matched their receiving logs down to the single pound. Someone was pulling the trucks off the route between the gate and the warehouse. Someone had a key to the high-security bolts on the container doors, or they were swapping the seals with duplicates bought from a supplier in San Leandro. They were lifting one pallet per truck from specific high-value categories, then resealing the doors before the driver reached the warehouse gate. The warehouse crew unsealed the truck, counted what was inside against their own internal sheet, which had been modified or predated, and signed the manifest. The loss was completely invisible to the corporate office on Montgomery Street. It didn't trigger an insurance claim. It didn't prompt a security review. It was a perfect, silent leak in the hull of the logistics machine, running at a rate that Denise calculated was worth roughly $84,000 per incident. She pulled her legal pad toward her. She didn't call Henderson. She didn't send an email to the corporate security director. She used her ruler to draw 3 clean columns. Date, gate weight, receiving weight. She spent 45 minutes tracing the Nagoya commodity code back through the previous 6 months of manifests. She found 11 other occurrences. Total variance, 44,400 pounds of commercial lithium packs. Total market value, $912,000. She completed the list at 4:58 p.m. She didn't print it on the office network. She copied the figures by hand into a small blue pocket notebook she had bought at the pharmacy on Eddy Street. She slides the notebook into her canvas tote, closed her screen terminal, and walked toward the coat rack. The boardroom on the 30th floor of the Montgomery Street Tower was silent except for the low, clinical click of the projection system as it cycled through the third-quarter volume forecasts. Lennox Ashford sat at the head of the long glass table, his hands folded over his abdomen, his face shadowed by the low-slung halogen fixtures above. Across from him sat Kendrick, his son, along with 4 regional directors from the West Coast Fulfillment Division. The volume numbers for the Oakland hub are within 2% of the model, Kendrick said, tapping the edge of his tablet against the glass table. The only friction point is the terminal turn time at Pier 40. We're seeing a 6-minute increase per gate cycle, which is adding about $12,000 a month to our short-haul drayage costs. We're looking at a software upgrade for the gate kiosks to see if we can automate the driver check-in. Lennox didn't look at the screen. He kept his eyes on his son's face. Kendrick had a tiny patch of skin near his left jaw that was slightly red, a shaving nick he had covered with a bit of expensive skin cream before the meeting. The software isn't the problem, Kendrick, Lennox said, his voice flat and heavy. Kendrick paused, his tablet hovering an inch above the table. Dad, the analysts ran the diagnostic. The check-in kiosks are running on an old database architecture from 2018. The processing time per license plate scan is 4 seconds longer than the industry average. The scale at the gate has a broken foundation bolt on the western corner, Lennox said. Every time a 40-ton chassis rolls over the frame, the load cell shifts 3 millimeters out of alignment. The driver has to shift into reverse, back out of the lane, and cross the pad a second time to clear the error code. It costs 4 minutes per truck. It's been doing that since the rainy week in January. The room became very quiet. The regional directors shifted their weight in their leather chairs, their pens remaining motionless over their notepads. Kendrick frowned, his eyebrows coming together in a line of genuine confusion. How do you know that? The facility maintenance log doesn't show any work orders for the Pier 40 scale. Because the facility maintenance director doesn't look at the scale, Lennox said. He looks at his budget reports. The report was brought to my desk this morning by one of your operations coordinators at the port, a woman named Carter. He pulled the small blue pocket notebook from his pocket and dropped it onto the glass table. It made a small, dull slide across the polished surface before stopping 2 inches from Kendrick's hand. Open it, Lennox said. Kendrick reached out, picked up the cheap paper book, and turned the pages. His face didn't change color immediately. It took 15 seconds for the blood to recede from his cheeks as his eyes traced the 3 hand-drawn columns. Date, gate weight, receiving weight. What is this? Kendrick asked, his voice dropping an octave. That's a ledger of $912,000 worth of commercial battery assets that left our inventory custody between November and last Tuesday, Lennox said. It happened on your route, Kendrick. It happened under the nose of your regional compliance team. They didn't see it because they were sitting in this room, adjusting the software models to look for 4-second delays in the license plate scanners. One of the regional directors leaned forward, his face tight with professional alarm. Mr. Ashford, if this data is verified, it's a systematic theft. We need to notify the Port Authority and the insurance underwriters immediately. We're not notifying anyone yet, Lennox said, standing up from his chair. He didn't look at the director. He kept his eyes on his son. Kendrick, you take the company car and you drive down to the South Hub right now. You take the gate logs from February 11th and you manually check the physical seal numbers on container ENL 8842B. You find out whose signature is on the receiving ticket at 4:40 in the afternoon. Dad, Kendrick said, standing up, his chair scraping against the floor with a sharp, metallic screech. That's a job for the internal security team. I have a presentation for the Logistics Council at 6. The Logistics Council can wait, Lennox said, his voice dropping into that dark, heavy register that his managers called the bankruptcy tone. You forgot $50,000 on a table in the lounge because your life didn't notice the weight of it. Now you've lost $1 million of client inventory because you didn't think the woman with the mop was worth looking at. You go down to the yard yourself. You climb onto the loading dock, you smell the diesel, and you look at the grease on the seal bolts until you understand what a friction point looks like in the real world. He turned away from the table, walked toward the glass wall, and looked out at the bay. The 30th floor was high enough that the container ships looked like toy boats floating in a zinc bucket. He didn't look back when the boardroom door clicked shut behind his son and the directors. The kitchen of the apartment on Fulton Street was 12 feet square, with high, Victorian ceilings that had been repaired with new plaster and painted a clean, unblemished eggshell white. The 2 windows faced west toward Golden Gate Park, allowing the late afternoon sun to enter at a long, raking angle that lit the floorboards without requiring the use of the small ceramic lamp in the corner. Denise Carter stood at the stove, a wooden spoon in her hand, stirring a pot of red beans and rice. She was wearing a cream-colored linen shirt and jeans. Her work clothes now consisted of tailored trousers and low-heeled leather loafers she bought from a store on Post Street. It was Tuesday at 5:45 p.m. She had been home for 15 minutes. Zuri's room was the first door down the hall. The door was open 6 inches, revealing a white wooden desk, a small bookshelf filled with paperbacks, and a neat bed covered in a blue and white quilt. Zuri wasn't at the desk. She was sitting on the rag rug in the living room, her lap occupied by a 6th-grade geography text, her fingers moving along the margins of a map of South America. Micah was sitting next to her. He was 6 now, his shoulders wider, his face losing that round, soft look of early childhood. He had a box of real artist's oil pastels, a gift Dr. Hadley had given him when he completed his therapy program in October. He wasn't drawing circles anymore. He was drawing a large, detailed sketch of a container crane, its long arm extending across the page in bold, black charcoal lines. He looked up at his mother as she walked out of the kitchen with a plate of sliced bread. "The Ashford Mariner is coming into the estuary tonight, Mom," he said. His voice was clear, the consonants sharp and distinct, the R sounds carrying that slight, precise ring of a child who had learned his speech from a professional linguist. "Mr. Henderson said the gate cycle is running at 3 minutes now because they fixed the foundation plate." Denise set the plate down on the table. She reached down, took his hand in hers, and looked at the charcoal grease on his thumb. "He told you that when you went to the office on Friday?" "Yes," Micah said, his lips forming a perfect, confident arc. "He let me sit in the terminal tractor. He said if I keep drawing the crane maps, he'll give me a job in the control tower when I'm 20. Denise smiled. It was the real smile, the one she had found on Fulton Street. She walked over to the refrigerator, a large, white modern unit that sealed with a quiet, satisfying whump that meant things stayed cold and stayed fresh and stayed where you put them. Taped to the door with 4 small magnets were 3 items. The first was the old $20 bill from her mother, still inside its grease-stained envelope, unchanged. The second was the piece of notebook paper from Zuri. I can watch Micah. I already do. The third was a small, hand-drawn map Micah had, completed during his last month of therapy. It showed 2 figures standing under a bright yellow circle, one tall, with round shoulders and a canvas bag in her hand, one small, with his fingers pointing up toward the glass. Below the drawing, Micah had written 3 words in uneven, blocky text. "MOM said moon." She touched the edge of the paper with her thumb, smoothing a small wrinkle that had formed near the magnet. She didn't look at the clock. She didn't need to check the bus schedule. Her life was no longer timed by the minute or the transfer loop. She had built a ledger that settled to 0 every night, and the margin was hers to keep. Lennox Ashford sat in his office at 7:14 p.m. on Thursday. The building was empty. The executive staff had cleared out at 6 to catch the commuter trains to Marin or the peninsula. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic whir-whir-whir of a vacuum cleaner 3 floors below, a sound he had spent 21 years ignoring but could no longer clear from his ears. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk, pulled out Opal's letter, and laid it flat on the leather blotter. He had read the text 2,555 times. The crease down the center had gone completely white, the paper soft and fibrous from 60 months of handling. He picked up his gold pen. For 7 years, he had treated the paper like a relic, a one-way message from a room he couldn't enter. Tonight, he placed the nib against the white space below her shaky signature. His handwriting was different from hers, thin, straight, precise, the script of an accountant checking a column. "I found her, Opal. She was cleaning the floor I walked on, and I almost didn't look down. Her son is speaking now. He says the word moon, like he discovered it himself. I'm walking down the stairs tonight. I want to hear what the building sounds like when the power is off." He let the ink dry for 60 seconds. He folded the sheet along the old white crease, slid it into the drawer, and clicked the lock into place. He didn't reach for his briefcase. He didn't check the automated dashboard on his screen. He walked to the corridor, bypassed the private elevator bay, and pushed open the heavy steel door marked stairwell. 30 floors. 960 concrete steps. He walked them one by one, his leather soles making a sharp, hollow echo that carried through the concrete shaft like a hammer against stone. He didn't hurry. He passed the doors to 24, 18, 12, the numbers painted in large white stencils on the red fire doors. He felt the cold air from the basement rising to meet him, a draft that carried the scent of grease, damp concrete, and industrial pine cleaner. When he broke into the lobby at 7:42 p.m., his breath was coming in long, heavy drafts through his nose. He walked across the polished marble floor. It was wet, a fresh sheen of cleaning solution reflecting the lobby lights like an oiled sheet of zinc. He stopped at the security counter. Darnell, the night shift guard, was sitting behind the terminal, a paper cup of noodle soup in his hand. He looked up, his jaw dropping slightly as he recognized the charcoal wool coat. "Mr. Ashford," Darnell said, standing up quickly, his spoon clicking against the plastic rim. "I didn't see you come down on the monitor. Is there an emergency?" Lennox stopped. He looked at the man's nameplate. It was brass, pinned to his shirt with two small clips. He had walked past this desk roughly 1,500 times across 6 years of corporate operations. "No emergency, Darnell," Lennox said, his voice dropping into a quiet, human register that sounded strange in the wide marble lobby. "Just finishing the shift. Have a safe ride home to Oakland tonight. The bridge is clear." He turned, pushed open the heavy glass doors, and stepped out onto Montgomery Street. His sedan was waiting at the curb, its engine purring like a large, dark cat in the mist. Miller had the door unlatched, his white glove resting on the polished chrome. Lennox didn't look at the car. He walked past the door, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his face lifted 3 degrees into the cold, gray salt fog that was rolling in from the gate. He turned south toward Market Street, his shoes making a steady, distinct click against the concrete sidewalk as he walked into the dark city alone. The value of this story does not conclude when the ink dries or the screen goes dark. Right now, as you read these lines, someone in your own building is clearing the bin before you arrive tomorrow morning. Someone in your office is wiping the glass doors so your view remains clear. We live in a world packed with invisible scaffolding, held up by hands that work while we sleep and carry burdens we have never had the courage to measure. If this narrative made you look down at the floor with a different lens, do not let it end as a momentary sentiment. Share this text with someone you know, not as an apology for the blind spots of our lives, but as a deliberate beginning. Look at the people standing 3 feet from you. Learn their names. Acknowledge the infrastructure of human dignity that surrounds you. Hit that subscribe button to join this community of deep, systemic observation, and let us start looking at what actually holds the world together.